Avoidant personalities often walk away believing they're protecting themselves, not realizing they're cutting off someone who truly cared. They convince themselves that detachment is strength until the absence becomes real. What seems like indifference on the surface eventually crumbles into quiet desperation, regret, and emotional unraveling. The real breakdown doesn't come when they leave. It comes when they realize no one is coming back. Delayed emotional realization in avoidance doesn't appear like heartbreak in the way most people imagine. It's not tears, panic, or sudden regret. It's a quiet, almost unnoticeable unraveling that begins long after the person they lost has already moved on. In the beginning, they feel nothing unusual. They convince themselves that the separation was necessary or that they never really needed that person in the first place. They slide back into routine, believing they're unaffected. They tell themselves that emotional distance is strength and that losing someone who cared is just another moment to brush off. But avoidants don't escape emotion. They postpone it. What people mistake for indifference is actually delay. Their system is built to suppress emotion in real time and only process it when the environment feels safe again. That safety often comes when the person who cared is already gone for good. The shift begins subtly. There's no one checking in anymore. No familiar message. No comforting presence in the background. The space once filled by someone patient, consistent, and warm becomes a hollow quiet. At first, they rationalize it. People grow apart, things end, life moves on. They may even feel a sense of relief, mistaking numbness for peace. But the mind has a way of circling back to what the heart avoided. It starts with a memory surfacing uninvited. Maybe a conversation, a laugh, a moment of softness where they were seen without judgment. They push it away, but it returns this time heavier. Days or weeks later, the silence becomes uncomfortable. The distance, once a shield, feels like exposure. They start noticing how often they use that person's presence as a quiet anchor. Not through confession or emotional sharing, but through the security of knowing someone cared without demanding anything in return. Now, their emotional autopilot begins to glitch. The things that once distracted them don't hit the same. The solitude that used to feel safe begins to feel suffocating. The realization doesn't hit like a storm. It spreads like a slow leak. They wake up one day and the absence feels louder. The delayed grief arrives disguised as irritability, restlessness, insomnia, or sudden waves of nostalgia they don't know how to process. They start replaying the past, not because they want to reconnect, but because their mind is finally catching up to everything their heart refused to feel. That's the part no one sees, the breakdown that hides behind a calm expression and a composed exterior. Avoidants don't fall apart when they lose someone. They fall apart when they realize that person isn't coming back. The emotional hit they dodged at the start returns with interest. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't care about pride. It fills the space they thought they could live without, and by the time they finally feel it, it's too late to fix what they never admitted they wanted. Losing someone who brought stability to an avoidance world creates a disruption they're not equipped to handle. On the outside, avoidants pride themselves on being self-contained, emotionally independent, and unaffected by closeness or distance. They often believe that needing someone makes them weak, so they structure their life to minimize emotional reliance. But despite their efforts, genuine care from someone steady and patient creates an invisible sense of grounding. That presence becomes a quiet stabilizer, something they don't consciously acknowledge until it disappears. When that connection is gone, what's left behind isn't just silence, it's inner chaos they have no tools to manage. Avoidants function by controlling their environment, emotions, and interactions. Predictability keeps them safe. The person who cared often became part of that unspoken sense of order. Whether through gentle check-ins, emotional consistency, or simply existing as someone who understood them, that presence created a rhythm. They didn't have to participate fully to benefit from it. They could keep their walls up and still feel the security of knowing someone was there without judgment or pressure. The loss of that subtle anchor leaves them unbalanced in ways they can't admit to anyone, including themselves. In the beginning, they might lean harder into structure, work, isolation, routines, distractions, to re-establish a sense of command. But stability built on suppression quickly crumbles. They may not cry or confess, but their behavior starts shifting. Sleep becomes irregular. Focus becomes harder. Small inconveniences feel heavier. Their mind, once compartmentalized and neat, becomes cluttered with intrusive thoughts and unresolved emotions. The absence of that person doesn't just leave a gap. It dismantles an unspoken support system that held their inner world together. Without that grounding influence, avoidants start noticing how much they relied on the other person for emotional regulation, even without direct vulnerability. Just knowing someone cared was enough to soften their edges. Now, with that energy gone, the emotional pressure they once ignored begins to surface. Irritation replaces calm. Restlessness replaces confidence. Their urge to detach intensifies, but the familiar coping mechanisms don't soothe like they used to. They won't say they're unraveling, but it shows in the way their internal balance collapses without warning. What they lose is not just companionship, it's the emotional stability they never admitted was being provided. Control was never the absence of need, it was a fragile illusion maintained by someone else's quiet care. When that care disappears, their world doesn't just feel empty, it feels unstable, unpredictable, and foreign, exposing the vulnerability they've spent their entire life avoiding. When someone who genuinely cared is no longer around, an avoidant is forced into a kind of emotional confrontation they've spent their entire life trying to outrun. As long as that caring presence existed, it acted like a buffer, absorbing tension, softening conflict, and offering acceptance without demanding openness. The avoidant didn't have to face their own emotional landscape because someone else unintentionally made it feel manageable. But once that person is gone, there's nothing left to hide behind. The silence becomes a mirror, and that's when the real discomfort begins. Avoidants avoid emotion not because they don't feel. They avoid because they feel too much and don't know how to process it. When they lose someone who cared, they're left alone with everything they never sorted out. Feelings they spent years suppressing, fear, shame, longing, regret, start rising to the surface without permission. There's no distraction strong enough to keep it all pushed down forever. The absence strips away their escape routes. There's no one checking in, no one providing quiet reassurance through their presence, no one reflecting back an image of them that feels accepted. They're stuck with their raw, unfiltered selves, and that's the version they've always rejected. Their inner critic gets louder. Old wounds resurface. They remember moments where they were cold, dismissive, or unresponsive, not because they didn't care, but because caring felt dangerous. Now, instead of someone soothing that internal tension, they sit alone with the awareness of everything they pushed away. It's not dramatic or visible. It's private, silent, and heavy. They may dive into work, distractions, or isolation to outrun the discomfort, but even those coping mechanisms start to fail when there's no external source of emotional grounding. Self-confrontation doesn't happen in one moment, it creeps in. They start questioning their choices, replaying interactions, and feeling an unfamiliar ache they can't label. They might feel anger without knowing why, or sadness disguised as exhaustion. They're forced to acknowledge patterns, how they shut down when someone got close, how they dismissed affection, how they mistook emotional safety for pressure. The hardest part is the realization that the person who cared wasn't the threat. They were the shelter. This stage is brutal for avoidance because it attacks the very identity they've constructed. They've spent years telling themselves they don't need anyone. That closeness is a risk. That distance keeps them safe. But alone with their thoughts, a quiet truth forms. What they feared wasn't other people. It was themselves. And without someone there to soften that reality, they're confronted with everything they've buried, with no escape from the weight of finally having to feel it. Avoidants often move through life with a strong appearance of independence, as if they don't rely on anyone emotionally. They build a narrative that they function best alone, that connection is optional, and that needing someone is a weakness. But beneath that outer layer, there is a quiet, unspoken dependency that develops when someone genuinely cares for them. It's not dependency in the traditional sense. There are no dramatic displays of attachment or obvious bids for closeness. Instead, it shows up in subtle ways: the comfort of knowing someone understands their silences, the ease of having a presence that doesn't demand more than they can give, the safety of being accepted even when they don't express emotion. Once that person is gone, the absence exposes just how much they relied on that emotional availability. They may not have asked for reassurance, but they felt it. They may not have reciprocated affection visibly, but they absorbed it. Avoidants often believe they are untouched by closeness because they don't express their need openly. But emotional dependency doesn't require confession. It forms through consistency, trust, and the relief of being cared for without judgment. When that care is suddenly gone, they don't just lose a person, they lose an emotional cushion that helped them manage life without facing their vulnerabilities directly. In the beginning, they tell themselves nothing has changed. They double down on detachment and convince themselves that solitude is natural. But their internal world starts to shift. The things they once brushed off become heavier. Stress feels harder to handle. Their mind reaches for the emotional support it once had, and for the first time, there's no one there who just gets it without explanation. The security they never admitted needing disappears, and it leaves behind a hollow unease they can't identify or explain. The dependency was never about constant communication or visible closeness. It was about emotional regulation. Someone else quietly helped balance the parts of them they refused to acknowledge. Without that stabilizing energy, their internal defenses begin to overload. They feel more irritable, more withdrawn, and more restless. They might isolate further to cope, but the isolation doesn't bring peace the way it used to. What makes it worse is the realization that they never appreciated or acknowledged that emotional presence while they had it. They didn't recognize it as support. They saw it as ordinary background noise in their life. Only in its absence do they feel the weight of having lost something they depended on but never admitted was important. And because avoidants rarely reach out or express vulnerability, that unmet dependency becomes a quiet ache they carry alone, one that no distraction fully silences. Regret for an avoidant doesn't arrive in the moment of loss. It arrives when the silence becomes permanent and the reality sinks, in that the person who cared is no longer within reach. At first, they convince themselves that walking away or pushing someone out was justified. They lean on rationalizations like, "It wouldn't have worked anyway," or "I'm better on my own." Their defenses stay strong while the other person is still emotionally or physically nearby. But once that door closes fully, when there's no message, no presence, no lingering attempt to reconnect, their mind shifts. The absence is no longer theoretical, it's real, solid, and irreversible. That's when regret quietly begins to take shape. Avoidants rarely feel the sting immediately because their coping style delays emotional processing. They shut down first and think later. But as time passes, memories resurface, moments when the other person tried to understand them, offered patience, or stayed when others would have left. They start remembering not the conflicts or discomfort, but the grace they were shown, the kindness they dismissed, the chances they were given. And instead of feeling relief, they start feeling the weight of everything they didn't reciprocate. The recognition comes slowly, often triggered by routine moments, catching themselves wanting to share a thought, realizing no one checks on them anymore, hearing a familiar song, seeing a small reminder. Their mind replays interactions, not to analyze someone else's behavior, but to quietly examine where they withdrew, shut down, or acted indifferent. It's not performative remorse. It's internal acknowledgement of what was lost through their own avoidance. What makes the regret sharper is the understanding that the person who cared didn't leave because they stopped feeling. They left because they finally gave up trying. And avoidants, deep down, know it wasn't about incompatibility, but about their inability to accept closeness without fear. They start recognizing how much that person offered safety without pressure, affection without force, presence without demands. And the painful realization is that they didn't lose just anyone, They lost the rare kind of connection that doesn't come often. By the time they fully understand the value of what they had, the timing is wrong. Avoidants don't reach out easily, and even when the urge appears, pride and shame hold them back. They don't apologize or ask for another chance, not because they don't want to, but because vulnerability feels like exposure. So the regret stays unspoken. They carry it alone, replaying possibilities that can't be reclaimed. The tragedy isn't that they didn't care. It's that they realized too late that someone cared in a way they may never find again. When an avoidant loses someone who genuinely cared, their default coping mechanism is to withdraw even further. On the surface, it looks like distance, silence, and emotional shutdown. But internally, it's not protection anymore, it's fallout. Avoidants have spent most of their lives believing that detachment keeps them safe, so when pain hits, they return to isolation because it's the only response they know. But this time, the withdrawal doesn't numb the hurt. It magnifies it. Instead of feeling in control like before, they start to experience their old strategies breaking down. Ignoring their emotions no longer makes them disappear. Pushing people away no longer gives them relief. The silence they once craved now feels heavy, almost punishing. They may stay busy, act unaffected, or seem unbothered, but their coping is no longer defensive, it's desperate. They retreat into themselves not because they don't care, but because they don't know how to process the loss without falling apart. Isolation becomes both a shield and a prison. They avoid friends, deep conversations, and emotional reminders, hoping the numbness will return. But the absence of the person who cared exposes the emotional void more intensely. They might scroll aimlessly, overwork, sleep irregularly, or dive into distractions, not to move on, but to escape their own thoughts. Nothing truly soothes them the way that person's steady presence once did, even though they never admitted they relied on it. One of the most painful parts is that their usual, "I don't need anyone," mindset starts collapsing under its own weight. Without that caring figure, the internal noise gets louder. They may feel restless, anxious, irritable, or unusually nostalgic, but they won't label it for what it is: grief and longing. The problem is that avoidants don't seek comfort when they're hurting. They disappear, hoping time will erase what they don't want to face. Yet, the more they detach, the more the loss follows them into every empty space. They also avoid reaching out because vulnerability feels dangerous and rejection feels unbearable. Even if they think about reconnecting or apologizing, they talk themselves out of it. Convincing themselves it's pointless or too late, they might check in silently, from a distance, through memories, online traces, or imagined conversations, but they refuse to be seen in their regret. What makes this stage so brutal is that their old armor doesn't work anymore. Detachment once protected them from closeness, but now it traps them in loneliness. They don't fall apart publicly, and they won't admit the impact out loud. But inside, the withdrawal stops being a choice and becomes a collapse. The very walls they built to feel safe become the same walls that keep them stuck with the pain they can't outrun.